Oh. Oh, wait, I have one quick question. All right. Hello? Nope, not ready yet. All right. Janine? I'm ready if you are. I am. Good morning. We're back. It is a little after 11 o'clock, but close. Thank you all. Next, we'd like to hear from Brenda Edelman.
Thank you. Brenda Edelman, Russian River Watershed Protection Committee. I did submit comments on the revised order and was told you're unable to accept them here. I sent in a letter Sunday night, and I have copies here, but I was told that you won't be accepting them, or it.
On the formal comment, can you
Yeah, we
pass
go
them
ahead.
out now, right?
Obviously, we recognize that this has been under a very short timeline.
Yeah.
And that comments have been, first of all, the change sheet, which had some fairly significant, although certainly within the scope, changes went out on Friday. So obviously,
Some of which are
we have
responsive
been-
to
we have
her
been receiving
comments,
the comments
so.
this morning, and so I would go ahead and allow Ms. Edelman to distribute them, but encourage her to, for the benefit of people listening both online as well as in the
to
background,
summarize
through
them so
all
that
the
people
points in her
people can hear.
comment letter.
But would you be interested in having a copy for
Yes.
yourself?
Now, that's what he's saying. We'd love to have them right now, but in your comments, summarize them for people who aren't sitting in the room.
I'm sorry, is this
Okay.
different than your May 26th letter?
No, I wrote a second letter
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
after I saw the
Good.
revisions. And, you know, I'm someone who comes at this in a more general experiential sense. I'm not a lawyer or scientist, so my presentation has a slightly different focus, and many of you are familiar with me and what I do. I have a lot of concerns about this. I've tracked this issue for a long time in our community. There's been a number of recycled water projects done, both. I'm not as concerned about the agriculture, and I've studied the data in terms of water use, in terms of application rates, and I think for the most part, most of the agriculture people have specific reasons for why they need to use the water carefully in most instances. What I've been really concerned about, or what I've seen some serious problems with, the urban reuse. And it's not everyone, you know, maybe a large percentage of the people are very conscientious and do everything correctly. But I've witnessed, taken pictures of, studied the reports and the documents, and I've discovered there are many irrigators in the urban areas who have repeated violations, and nothing has been done about it. They really, I'd like to just make one suggestion right now, is that people who appear through their reports to be using too much water based on the size of their site really need to be monitored more closely, that there need to be special requirements for those parcels and irrigators that seem to be out of compliance a lot. Or, for instance, there's one couple of 2-acre parcels in the town of Roner Park that were using like 1 million gallons of water on a very small site and had multiple instances of overflow. There are pictures that have been submitted that, you know, people are aware of this happening. And the worst part is that where I even sent you a picture of a couple areas, one where you can see it going down the drain. And when you have infrequent inspections, this irrigation runoff could go on for a very long time on a daily basis because no one's required to make a report. And the reports I've looked at many reports, are inadequate. Very often inspections are done when the system is not turned on. In our area, they switched to nighttime irrigation, which means someone like myself can't go out and take a look and see what I see. And so, you know, I have to go in the other direction from what the previous speaker said, because I would like to see daily inspections, to tell you the truth, especially of parcels that have been out of compliance that consistently irrigate huge amounts of water.
Now, can I ask you a question? Because when you see these, do you report these to anyone? These, because
I filed 2 reports over the years,
with the
but I
regional
can't
board?
go out in the middle of the night. And
No. I just, you know, you said that you've got lots of pictures of people
Yeah.
who are over irrigating, whether they're over irrigating with potable water or with recycled water or with any kind of water. It needs to be reported because the regional boards have limited capacity.
it has been reported.
Okay.
There have been cease and desist orders filed, but no ACLs.
Right.
There's never been anyone fined, and obviously if they keep doing it, something isn't working. That wherever there's repeat offenders, and there was quite a few of them, I'd say maybe 1/3 of them in Roner Park have been repeat offenders. I think Santa Rosa's a little more conscientious, although now that they switched to nighttime irrigation, I'm not totally sure. It's just the evidence may be gone by the time I get to see it. And another issue is, you know, when we're in a drought, there's less wastewater available to irrigate. So there have been instances with Santa Rosa where they had to turn their farmers down for water because they didn't have enough to give out.
Sure.
And it just seems that conservation's a lot more cost effective than irrigation with wastewater. And I'm not saying you shouldn't use irrigation with wastewater, but and I could see where it makes sense for the agriculture, but a lot of times some of these towns, and of course many of you know I'm deeply concerned and have provided a lot of information about endocrine disruption, and the tertiary water has many unregulated toxins in it that we just don't know about. You know, people, I hear them, the tertiary water looks just like regular water, and the average person walking down the street and sees a puddle doesn't have any idea. The little signs they put out are so tiny and hard to find that I went looking for them and couldn't find them. Someone had to tell me where they were located. They're half of the size of a piece of notebook paper, usually in dark colors that aren't real visible. So I'm just deeply concerned about, you know, getting rid of CEQA, and the anti-DEG requirements seem to be looser. They don't seem to require require evidence that they are meeting anti-DEG requirements. And one of the worst parts is they're supposed to use agronomic rates. Well, I went in the files and tried to find information and analysis of why any given parcel, what agronomic rates were being used, and couldn't find anything. I was just told, oh, they're doing agronomic rates, but there really needs to be some evidence and some reporting that clearly identifies how they're meeting those agronomic rates, and they need to be periodically updated because things change, and it isn't, granted, always a simple thing to do. But this is wastewater, and it's being put on schoolyards, it's being put on parks, places where children play. I've seen it ponding at bus stops, and people don't really know that's wastewater. And there's, you know, residual chemicals and bacteria in even the tertiary. So just to say they're meeting requirements at the treatment plant really isn't good enough in my mind. And I have all kinds of articles. I was going to just read you a few titles. Wastewater, a source of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. I don't know if that's being tested or not. A recent article, mass fish deaths. Millions have been found dead all over the world in the past month, including Lake Mendocino, where the carp were dying. And carp, it takes a lot to kill a carp. I mean, one article, public voices concern over Washington birth defects increases. One, Spanish male fish feminized by pollution. And that's a real big issue with these endocrine disruptors. And 6 major extinctions being talked about more and more, that we are in, that hundreds and maybe thousands of species are going extinct. No one really knows why in most cases, and except it's believed that it's all from man-made sources, causes. Declining male fertility linked to water pollution, and so on and so forth. Autism estimate. I mean, this is from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Autism prevalence gone from 1 in 150 in 2002 to 1 in 68 in 2010. And the list goes on and on. I'm inundated every single day with more information that's coming out. And I don't know how to address that in this current order, but I'm terrified that in the desperate feeling people have around this drought, that unwise practices will be used and implemented. One interesting thing in the revised order, it said that this is being done to protect the fish because it'll leave more water for the fish. Well, next year you're going to be asked to make a decision on lowering the flows, basic flows for, and decision 1610 for the Russian River. And their National Marine Fisheries Service has made the argument that high flows are bad for the fish.
Right.
So in terms of making policy decisions, you're going to be in the crossfire. Is it good for the fish to have low flows or high flows? Well, I think that depends on the circumstances and the timing, and it's all very complex.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm afraid this order doesn't consider any of that. And I'm sorry there aren't fish, maybe they're here, but it sounds like the fishery people aren't here, and I think they should be closely consulted. And so,
just so you know, there is a separate provision that does require looking at flows if there's going to be a reduction in flows.
And there were certain things I just didn't understand, and I don't understand the role of the regional board, because with the emphasis on Title 22, Title 22 does not protect the environment, and it doesn't fully protect human health either. And in fact, most of their Title 22 is focused on not having cross connections between the pipes, but it doesn't seem to care what happens after it leaves the pipes. So you have the exact same wastewater. Santa Rosa has a 200-page permit for discharge of their wastewater, and although so many of those regulations go away when it becomes a non-point discharge through incidental runoff. And I'm concerned they do have a reclamation permit, and I don't know the role of the reclamation permit in light of this order. I don't know if it remains in force.
It would be maintained unless they wanted to come get this, in which case the regional board would still have the authority to make findings and limit it in some ways. It doesn't
wish
immediately
someone
go
would fund
away.
more
If you were
info-
going to change the existing permit, there would have to be a public hearing and discussion on the change in the existing permit.
Yeah, and that's what
all the-
happened in the San Francisco region 18 years ago. There were specific reclamation requirements for specific treatment plants, and over time, they all opted to enroll in the general master order, which has been in place, and studies have been done about groundwater and surface water associated with recycled water use. All the school yards and parks you talked about, been doing it for 2 decades and keeping a close eye on things, and we haven't seen scientifically significant effects. It's been
Well,
safe.
that's because when it comes to certain kinds of health effects, there is no way of proving what the cause was. When it comes to chronic illness, there's just no way we can prove what triggered that illness specifically. And there's really a need for precaution. And I know there was one other big point I wanted to make.
No, go ahead.
But anyway, I'm sorry. And let's see. Oh, I know what the issue with the nutrients. The runoff from Santa Rosa and Rona Park end up in the Laguna, and the Laguna is highly impaired for 6 constituents, including nutrients, temperature, sediment, mercury, and dissolved oxygen. And when there are discharges of any kind, and if you have very low requirements for monitoring and for reporting, then we're going to have runoff into the Laguna, and it's going to have dire effects. And some of you are quite familiar with what the Laguna's been looking like. And protection from nutrient pollution, Santa Rosa is required to not increase discharges of phosphorus into the Laguna. And so if you have this runoff happening, and you don't have people inspecting frequently, it's a discharge. And even somewhere in here it refers to discharges as opposed to just, I forget the word I'm trying to think of. But at any rate, application, if there was only application at agronomic rates and that was closely monitored and enforced, I would not have problems with using recycled water. But what I'm saying is that without oversight, good oversight on this, people are people, and if you have the 4,000 irrigators in a housing project, it's going to happen, and unless there's really clear-cut requirements in there. And I don't know how we're going to further protect the Laguna if this happens. And also, one other thing, a lot of the runoff, the bacteria that gets into the river, and that's being studied now as part of a TMDL with the regional board, is coming from runoff from the urban areas. So this is just one more impact from the urban areas that has implications downstream. And one more thing I mentioned in my comments was that in terms of protection of beneficial uses, the lower river is a major recreational area, and the local economy is dependent on recreation. And let me tell you, when flows are low, the river gets gross with nutrients. And people lose business, and it's a terrible, terrible problem for our area. And so it seems sometimes like our beneficial use doesn't get the same consideration as some of the other beneficial uses. And I know sometimes the squeaky wheel gets the most attention, but I just implore you to consider all of these things I'm saying when you make your decision. Oh, one last thing. I was wondering, is there an endpoint to this order, or does it just go on forever?
What is the regular review? Is there one on a general permit? That's a
So
good question.
as,
I should know the answer to that.
as waste discharge requirements, unlike NPDS permits, they do not have a fixed endpoint. Instead, the board is under an obligation to periodically review the general waste discharge requirements. That's under Porter Cologne. Obviously, you as the board can put in any additional requirements that you may choose in terms of when the board would revisit the order.
Oh, so we could do that. That's interesting. Thank you, Mrs. Edelman, and thank you for all the time that
Thank you
you
for
put into
listening.
your comments.
Yeah.
For a non-expert, you put a lot of care into it, and I think staff was trying to be responsive. I have a couple of questions, just as I did on Mr. Smith's comments, again, just to help illuminate, and then we'll come back at the end. One of the issues in these comments and some others is obviously the regional board executive officer has the ability to make findings largely. I think what people had in mind was dealing with salts and nutrients if you have a water body you're particularly concerned about, and obviously water use would like us to be clearer about the evidentiary basis for those findings to be made. But a question has arisen about what kind of notification, a number of commenters, what kind of notification the public has when someone is enrolling in one of these permits and the executive officer may or may not decide to make those findings. Where does the public find out about the issuance of one of these permits or the consideration of the issuance, the enrollment in one of these permits or a set of findings? How does that pop up?
Right now, we don't have a specific requirement for public notice of the executive officer's decision whether to approve the notice of intent. We envisioned that as a fairly ministerial act, that if they determine that the proposal complies with this proposed order, they would enroll, and if there was a determination that the proposed discharge would not comply with this order, they would adopt the site-specific order, which would go through the full regional board process with public comment and a chance to.
All right, so that one would go through
That one would.
public comment, and so then the goal of the general permit in general is so that it can be ministerial, and so that would suggest that other than the findings, if we have a concern about more incidental runoff or monitoring, we just do it in this permit. That's the purpose of it, right? To
That was
streamline the
our purpose,
process.
Streamline rather than create a whole
Yet
separate
another
process.
hurdle. So, okay, that makes sense. The next question I have then, we've talked about agronomic rates for ag purposes. Does that count for turf watering too? So in the situation that been noted where you have repeated runoff from landscape irrigation, is that per se a violation of, would that be a violation of this permit too?
It is. We attempted to cover both, and if it looks like we haven't, we're going
Just
to want to address
show-
that.
Show me where, just it's long, and I actually did read it, but where is it? You got it? Where? 16. Sorry. I
Looks
just
like
was focusing more
Prohibition
on
A3 is
irrigation.
one location.
Yeah, that's key.
A3 and A7.
Yeah, and also A2, which has a prohibition when soils are saturated. So,
So, but
All right.
prohibition A3 basically says recycled water shall not be allowed to escape from the use areas. And there's also the language consistent with the recycled water policy regarding incidental runoff, that's A5. And incidental runoff is defined in attachment D of the order.
Okay.
and part of the reason why there's nighttime irrigation is to avoid, human contact during irrigation. So it's not to escape the eyes of the public. It's,
Oh.
it's
But
it's
it
an
has
exposure
that,
issue.
Yes.
And conservation as well. So it's actually, exactly, there's a lot of good reasons to irrigate at night.
And did you say, or did someone just suggest that folks who sign up for the permit need to certify that they will do this or they have been doing this periodically? I mean, do we end up with something somewhere in the record at some point where someone says, I am doing this in compliance?
Administrative.
I'm just talking about enforcement, so that,
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well,
Does a user
have
have to send in something to say that they are going to, on a monthly basis, do something, or?
Well, the administrator is responsible for making sure that's done. So whoever signs up as the administrator, it could be the producer, the distributor, it could be a JPA, irrigation district, they're responsible that this occurs. So the user may be doing the inspections, but the administrator signs up to say, I'm going to certify
that it does
that this is happening.
But the user doesn't have to send something to the administrator unless the administrator asks for it. If the administrator delegates to the user the inspection,
Yes. Then they would have
that
to
may or may
send-
not be in writing back to the administrator. Is that correct?
I believe if the administrator delegates that the inspections would be done by the user, they would need to send the information, the monitoring information and the inspection information to the administrator.
Yeah, the concept is that the administrator gets approval from the regional board to issue recycled water use permits, and then those use permits will be issued to the users. And then as part of that, the administrator can include any monitoring requirement that is needed.
And if you look specifically at Section C of the order, that starts on page 18, it's water recycling administration requirements. There is a specific provisions from 6 through 8 talking about administrator ensuring that recycled water meets the quality, talking about doing inspection or assigning an agent to do inspections. So those are the provisions that specifically require administrator to make sure that it is actually the whole permit provisions are complied with.
Yeah, C6 also talks about applying only at agronomic rates. So it specifically directs the administrator to oversee the user on that matter.
Yeah, and specifically C9 says the administrator shall require users to comply with the administrator's use area conditions. So there is, that's the structure that's set up, so that each individual user is not coming to apply for a permit.
Right.
Or
It
reporting?
does say that the regional board shall inspect.
Yeah, regional boards have, I guess I shouldn't speak as an attorney, but regional board's authority to do inspections and enforcement
Right.
is not superseded by this order.
Well, what I would, sorry.
No, go ahead, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, on that point, I really appreciate how thoughtful you've been in your testimony, and
Thank you.
even though you have concerns over a period of years that you are, open to the use. I would just say maybe if we could have some report back to us to see how this plays out. I want to make sure that it actually gets used, so I'm curious to see after, assuming we adopt this, how many of these permits are taken advantage of. And then with respect to enforcement, I mean, there's monitoring, there's inspections, but it's not going to do any good if there's no enforcement, or if there's limited enforcement. So, and you bring up a good point about repeated violations. I am not familiar with the various options, but I suspect for repeated violations, there's a way to ratchet things up, but it's not going to do any good if it doesn't get used. So just maybe as the day progresses, if we could think about what a report back would look like.
Yeah, and at what frequency? A couple of years, year, whatever. Please think about that.
Could I ask one question?
Yeah.
Would it be possible to request that inspection should be done when the system is functioning and not when it's turned off?
Why not?
Well, there would, as Board Member Moore spoke about, there are conditions where they would want to reduce public contact, and so I suppose we could have board staff go out, but if it's operating in the middle of the night to avoid public contact, it's somewhat difficult for regional board staff to do the inspections at that time.
Yeah, but there might be times when it makes sense because it's not public contact isn't the only issue.
Well,
I
but
think
also,
they could certainly
an inspector-
ask them to turn on the system so that they could monitor it during the daytime.
No, I mean, but if the issue is overwatering or the issue is agronomic rates, you kind of have to have at least spot checks of when it's turned on.
yeah,
I
I'm
mean,
not
that's just reasonable.
I'm not sure, though. I mean, I think also within the realm of reason, you can go in the daytime and see evidence of overwatering from the previous night, in the morning. So during normal hours, we want to keep this within sort of the reasonable range of the daily activity. So I'm comfortable, I mean, with daytime inspections of nighttime use.
One thing I've been told is that because of the issue around incidental runoff, if you catch a runoff incident where the water's turned off and a lot of time has gone by, then they say, well, that was just a few gallons, that was incidental, when you really miss the major discharge of water into the system.
I think metering, which is required in the order, you can get to the bottom of
Yeah,
that.
you'd be able to do the math. Right. All right. We can come back to some of these questions. Can someone help? Because I know hers are not the only comments that talk about CECs, and I know we spent a lot of time on this in the monitoring discussions about CECs, where we chose the 8 categories based on what the expert panel said, and then they'll be coming back to us. The issue of CECs is handled in the treatment process, and we're in that process of looking at it kind of across the board in terms of wastewater treatment and the aquatic environment, aquatic discharges, and recycled water in general. I mean, it is an issue that we will be working on and figuring out and exploring, and I know our approach, based on what the experts said, is to get the monitoring, and then we're from the systems in general, and we'll be coming back, and obviously that is going to inform additional layers of treatment off into the future as we think about the lake meads and even larger water bodies and the eventual contact with drinking water, albeit at a very dilute level. So I think that's the arena in which the CEC investigation will take place, not just in the context of incidental runoff of recycled water, right? Can you help explain that? Because it's not that we're not concerned about that. We have a process to do the studies of that and figure out what the next levels of treatment are going to be, right?
Yeah, as you're aware, as part of the recycled water policy, CECs were looked at extensively, as well as an advisory panel was formed to evaluate and make recommendations regarding monitoring CECs. And the policy requires that that panel be reconvened in 5 years, which is about time for us to do that. And we would propose that as part of that process, to kind of look at some of the issues that are raised through this order and any new findings that the panel comes across, and handle the CEC monitoring through the revised policy when it gets adopted in the future. So current provisions in the order are consistent with the policy, which does not, which only requires CEC monitoring for groundwater recharge projects.
Mm-hmm.
And,
But that will yield
would
the
be the best
information on which we, at a much greater concentration, that will yield the information we are going to need to make for the next generation of requirements.
Exactly, and if in future the policy is revised and additional monitoring for CEC is required, that would trigger the need to revise this order, then
Right.
staff would come back with a revised order to
Right.
propose. to the
And
board.
I just want to make sure, Jonathan, there is some work being done now at SWRCB on monitoring of emerging contaminants in large scale, hundreds actually. And that report is going to be out fairly soon. And I want to make sure everyone who's listening and is in the audience, CECs are not a recycled water
No.
issue per se. In fact, some of the worst CECs are the fire retardants, and they're in landfills. And so there's a lot of interest in CECs, which we are absolutely committed to being on top of. So, Jonathan, could you tell us a little bit about how the monitoring work is going with
Sure, and I'm sorry that I missed part of what Charlotte was saying, so I might repeat something, and I apologize for
it's
that.
fine.
But there are essentially 3 different activities that have been ongoing. The first one's completed, which was the expert panel on what kind of monitoring for recycled water use, and it laid out surrogate sampling that would indicate different classes of
Right.
compounds.
Right.
But their primary recommendation was that this chasing chemical by chemical was not a practical approach to CEC monitoring,
Right.
and suggested that that we invest in looking at a screening technology. The technology that they suggested was bioanalytical techniques, and I will get to that in just one second. And then the second was, after that panel convened and made the recommendations on recycled water, actually, as they were ending that, we were approached by the Packard Foundation to see if we could extend that panel to look at coastal discharges, so discharges to streams and coastal ecosystems. They wanted to do coastal, we added streams, so we had environmental impacts associated with it. That panel completed about a year ago, and their first recommendation is that we pilot their approach, and so we are working with the POTWs to develop a pilot project to do that large-scale monitoring approach for the pilot. Both of those include the revisiting of the expert panel's methodology and chemicals on a periodic basis. This year would have been the first 5-year, but because of the timing it took us to get the information into the recycled water permits, we really don't, in my opinion, didn't have sufficient information to justify doing it this year, so we put a delay on that for another year so we get more concrete information. And then the third, which is the area that where we're headed, these are really interim, those first two, is using these bioanalytical techniques to do widespread looks at mode of action within the cell. So what a bioanalytic technique does is it identifies how it impacts the cell biology, and it uses a set of genetically altered bacteria, essentially, that light up when that function of the cell is impacted. And it covers all. The first one that they looked at was the one that was most concerned, is endocrine disruption, and that technique has now been tested along worldwide. Scientists, not only here in the United States, but in Australia and in Europe, they put together 2 joint task force to look at that, and they have a technique that is that has moved from laboratory to a production scale. We will be getting the report on that this month. We will likely need to work on supporting getting that rollout to our wastewater agencies, but that is essentially ready to go this year for screening all the endocrine disruption activity chemicals in a water sample. They will move on now. There are 4 other modes of action that they're looking at, and they'll be moving on to look at the techniques and how to make those work. And I'm sorry, for the life of me, I can't remember. I think it's the next one is respiration. Cell respiration is the next technique, but I could be wrong about that. I was been focused on the endocrine disruption. So this is a really a game changer in how to address CECs, because we will never be able to address the hundreds of thousands of potential chemicals that might be in there. We have to go to some sort of mode of action, and it's really right down to the cellular level.
Right, and those findings are going to apply not just to recycled water, but to wastewater treatment plant discharges in the first place.
Yes.
Right, which is the place, and just plain old water. Just plain old water.
Yes.
And this actually is the cutting edge of where we are in this phase of the water quality world. So.
And it's also looking at the treatability of the compounds, so you look at it throughout the process and see where you have reductions in these types of mode of action chemicals.
Right.
That's really good. And then also, a lot of this comes back to source control, and that is what products are formulated in the first place that we use as consumers, and then commercially and that sort of thing. And so there's a linkage between what we're talking about here and the Department of Toxic Substances Control's Green Chemistry Initiative, and which they've partnered with wastewater treatment plants throughout the state to really point out those we can take it to the bioanalytical technique, but just those chemicals that are turning up and, where they're found in the product stream, and re-registering them and asking that basic question, do we need it, number one, and if we do, is there a less toxic alternative? And so there's a real connection, between what DTSC, our sister agency, is doing, and then our environmental surveillance, so we can feed back to what products we choose to use in society, which is ultimately the source of a lot of these problematic chemicals, whether endocrine disrupting or other, cell biology impacts. So let's keep that, front and center, as the products that we're using ultimately are the source of these things. And we can treat to a certain level, but we really need to inform the dialogue about what the products that we choose to use.
Yeah, we should think about, I know we're always sort of, we do a good job of urgent and important, but since there's so much going on, it might be worth thinking about doing, again, an info session on sort of cutting edge issues, technology, as we're looking towards the next decade of work. I mean, looking ahead as opposed to looking over our shoulder. That'd be kind of fun. I mean, after coming off the 2 meetings I was on, I think that would be a nice space to spend some time on
We'll be bringing
sooner
you
than later.
the results from the bioanalytical group, and which will include what they've accomplished and what their what the next steps are and how do we move this forward. I don't have a date for you yet because the report's supposed to be finalized this month, but it will be
That's in the
soon.
near term. Okay, that is great. Other questions? I jumped in. I like letting you guys ask questions first. All right, thank you very much, and I'm assuming you'll stay with us because we're going to listen to everybody and then come back to
Yeah,
discuss.
I really appreciate your consideration of my concerns, and I'm very pleased to hear about this work that you're doing, and I look forward to being involved in that at some point.
Great.
Thank you.
Great, we're counting on that. Cards. Toby Roy, San Diego County Water Authority.
Hi, just to, San Diego County Water Authority, we're a wholesale water agency, and our member agencies do recycle water. In our region, we deliver about 28,000 acre-feet a year of non-potable recycled water. And I'm in light of kind of the discussion here, we do support all of the comments that were made by Dave Smith and ask that those changes be made. But I did want to focus on one area that you all have been talking about, and that is the use site oversight. And in our area, our member agencies all have master permits, and we do appreciate the changes that staff made that let them stay under those permits until they expire. But what we do, and I would see it working the same way under this permit, is it's not just the agencies do annual site visits, but that's not the whole of the program to oversight these use sites. So it starts with the site supervisors. So those are the people who are out there every day operating those irrigation systems, and we put every site supervisor has to go through training. So they understand what the requirements are, what they're supposed to be doing, and they should, every day that they go out and irrigate and work on that system, they should keep in mind the requirements that they're under for operating a recycled water site. Secondly, every agency adopts a set of rules and regulations that applies to all the users. So we have ability, if the users are out of compliance, to do enforcement on those users, to comply with all the requirements that we would be under in the permit. So they're